I am Shihan Ron Layton, and it is my most high honor to present you with a great, awesome, amazing special edition of the Kwanmukan Monolog. With us today, I am honored to speak to Mrs. Anderson, accompanied by Shihan David Ames and Sensei Joni Anderson. Everyone, welcome. Mrs. Anderson, hi.
Hi.
So I wanted to talk to you today about just what are your earliest remembrances of karate? What do you think about karate? Like when and where? What were you thinking when Mr. Anderson said, "Hey, I'd like to start doing karate"? What did you think about any of that?
I didn't think too much about it until he actually got there, and then I had a heck of a time finding him to come home.
So it sounds like it occupied a lot of his time.
Mm-hmm. He loved it.
And so do you think that it was one of these things that it was inside him, it was driven, he was passionate about this kind of stuff? What do you think? How would you describe it?
I'm not sure, but I mean, when he got into it, he really loved it, and it was important to him. He even got books on it and read it, so he knew more than the teacher. So eventually, he kind of left. Ilju got sort of mad at him.
And so I think that you're probably talking about Ilju Kim.
Yeah, and then most of them followed him. Ilju kind of kicked him out, and then everybody followed him except for one or two people.
And so, Joni, do you remember Ilju Kim?
I do remember Ilju. When I was little, he was always in our lives. Him and Karen, we went over their house. My dad had a very close relationship. My mom and dad, we would go over and we got to learn about their culture. And Ilju taught us karate, me and my cousins, E.J. and Laura, and Kareem, but I was more in E.J. and Laura's age group. And he was really strict with us, but we respected him a lot. And he did some things, taught us. But then we'd go over, Dad and Mom were so close with them, and they'd come over our house and on Orlando, and then we'd go over their house. And I can't remember where they lived, but it seemed like they had like this Korean store or whatever, and they really turned us on to some really interesting food. And that was one of the first times they ate seaweed. But I remember crawling around on their floor at their house and playing with their kids who were younger than I was. And I just remember Ilju was a good guy who was really strict when he taught. If we were bad, we were in Kibadachi, come by and smack us on the legs. And then when we do, like in karate, I think I told you this, when we'd be beginning and stuff, they'd come, they actually did different practice. They'd stand on our knees to make sure we were, in that position real good to get us nice and limber. And he was really good. But my mom and dad, they really had a good relationship with him.
So, Shihan Ames, do you remember Ilju Kim?
No. Mr. Anderson had separated from Ilju Kim in 1972. I started with Mr. Anderson in 1976. So I went to some of his tournaments. I did find out from a friend of mine who was inducted into the Kukiwon Hall of Fame when he was over in Korea that Ilju Kim remembered me and asked if I was still involved. So, because of my having been one of Mr. Anderson's big competitors, and I'd gone to some of his tournaments and competed and opened some of the eyes of the Koreans when I did Japanese kata in a Korean tournament. But that was my experience with Ilju Kim and Dong Ju Che. They were the strangers. They were the high dons. They were the mystical, often the distance that I was not allowed to approach, but I should be very respectful of them.
Very different approach to the instruction of martial arts, isn't it?
Yes.
So, Mrs. Anderson, you said something that I want to talk to you about a little bit more. You said that Mr. Anderson, he would read these books, and then after a very short while, he knew more than the instructor. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Okay, my husband, he really loved karate. I don't know why, but he loved it, and so he really studied it and read it and talked about it, and Mr. Kim got kind of annoyed with him, I think.
Mom,
So,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you remember that Dad would, Akron U, you taught that class at Akron U, and Dad would take a lot of his things after the class at Akron. He'd teach the class a lot, and then after the class, he'd get together. They formed the karate club because he talked about a lot of the things he was learning in the books, and he would put them into practice, and they'd work them out.
I think Ilju might have got mad at my husband and kicked him out, but I think almost all of the gym, but 2 or 3 people followed George. So at first they came to the house. That was horrible. And they did karate in my living room, and, like in the winter. But in the summer they did it more like outside, thank God. But then it turned out he just knew he had to somehow get a gym.
So you may be one of the rare families that your home, your residence, was actually a dojo because everybody showed up
Yep.
to train at your house.
Yes. Yeah, well, that was after Ilju kind of kicked my husband out. Then everybody followed George to our house. It was what was. Well, there might have been 1 or 2 probably stayed with him. I don't know, but
Yeah.
a lot of them. I mean,
Do you remember, Mom? It was interesting because down the road, now this is after a while, down the road, I'm skipping forward into the future, but I mean, people, when they would come in for competitions or anything, I mean, they always went to Mom's house. The top guys that were coming in, they always wanted to glean. They always wanted to go and, so we'd end up with all kinds of people spending the night. She'd have sleeping bags all over the floor. Do you remember that, David?
No, I wasn't around.
Oh,
at
you
that
weren't
time.
around at that time. Okay, yeah, we had sleeping bags all over the floor, and people would camp out, and they would do talk karate all night.
So, Mrs. Anderson, do you remember some of the people who would show up? People like Johnny Lineberger?
oh, I remember him, yeah.
Do you remember Philip Warren?
That
Yes.
name sounds awfully familiar.
Philip Warren, he's a black gentleman. He is my size and build to a T. Little guy, tournament champion. He was a superb fighter, right up there with Tony Clark.
Tony Clark was over all the time.
I remember Tony Clark, yep. He came over, but no, the karate people didn't come over.
So, I remember most of those people. I particularly remember Tony Clark, and I know Johnny, world champion Johnny Lineberger. I know him.
Yeah.
And so, do you think what was it about Mr. Anderson that just allowed so many great martial artists to be attracted to him? What quality did he have?
I think he really loved karate and was into it and read it. And, he studied it.
So you also said something that I think the listeners are going to find very interesting. I always thought that Mr. Anderson, he knew more about karate than the vast majority of people who actually thought they knew about karate.
It's because he studied it. He loved it and he studied it.
So did he travel? Did he read books? Did he travel? Did he train with other people? How did you see him study?
Well, he read a lot of books, but I think
He
that
traveled.
He
and
traveled.
He traveled a lot. And Oliver, that's what he did. And he met up with great men. Tom LaPuppet.
I remember
there's so
LaPuppet.
many. Jim Caldwell. He traveled with the team. And I honestly can say, just I'm saying this to my mom, I personally don't feel like have ever seen anybody with a deeper passion to make an impact on this particular subject like I did my father. I just admire that about him tremendously. He had such a love, but he didn't just read the books and study them. He'd get together with other people that, it was like a team. They'd get together and they'd work out the things that he learned. So it wasn't just him, but he was a leader because he had such a love for people and a love to learn this, and he wanted to perfect it. So he would go other places. He traveled all over, and then his title, whatever title he had at the given time, which were many, would allow him to travel even further out, into other nations. I know when he died, I know that we heard they were speaking his name over the airwaves all over the globe. So he had, I say that just to say that he had been and he had made an impact wherever he went, because he loved to meet with top officials that were people that were really into karate, that loved it and wanted to learn and grow. And I think that's where he was able to bring the best out of all the different karate forms so that they could have something that they could take international. I mean, that's how I always understood it. But I know my dad and my mom was right there beside him. And Mom won't tell you this, but they hosted, Mom would cook. They would go out and she would get tons and tons of food. And they would host tons of people at the house. And they would come and they just, her and Dad both had a tremendous gift of hospitality. And they had some of the, important people would come over from, remember, from England. Do you remember that, David? From different places around the globe. And here they lived in little humble West Akron, Orlando Avenue. They didn't really care about the house being perfect or anything. They had a couple like a big Great Dane and all us kids running around. But all those people, when they came, they really didn't care either. All they wanted was to talk to Dad and learn and glean. And he wanted to glean off of them. I remember Larry Overhaul being over, and him and Dad out in the yard practicing techniques that they had learned. I mean, he didn't care if he was in the neighbor outside or in the house. You know, they just, I think it was the passion that set him apart. There was just
He was a passionate, believe me, about karate.
And he wanted to see that passion extend, that love for karate extend to where it would, everybody could glean from it, not just him. So it was never, selfish, and I did notice that about him, is that he wanted his students to go further than him. So like when he took David here to, the World Games or whatever you guys went to, he wanted David to do better and excel. I mean, farther than he ever excelled. He was happy about that.
Yep.
And I think that stood out, that was an appeal to people. It was attractive.
So, Mrs. Anderson, do you remember those dinners? Do you remember? Because it sounds like to me, so sometimes martial artists will get together and they'll go someplace. They'll go into a mountain or they'll go to a hotel and they'll do this thing called a retreat. And everybody will get together and they'll train. It's kind of like symposium, and they'll break bread together. They'll do all of these kinds of things. And it sounded like what Mr. Anderson did was he had like a perpetual retreat at the Anderson residence. Like he did it all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did a lot of cooking.
So what was on the menu? What kind of stuff?
I don't remember. I just remember cooking.
I just remember huge trays of stuff and Mom going out and getting food, and she would cook. I mean, she cooked it. She cooked like big things of chicken and mashed potatoes. She was younger then, and she cooked chili. She loved making chili, whatever. She always cooked.
So it sounds like the Anderson residence was the ultimate martial arts sleepover.
Yes, it was.
So much so, Ron, that she actually still has two stoves.
Yes.
Two stoves and ovens right next to each other.
What's 10 more?
From all the cooking.
What's 10 more?
Right.
So, Shihan Ames,
Yes.
So we know, because Mrs. Anderson has told us, one of the things that set Mr. Anderson apart is that he studied really hard. And it sounds like he studied harder than anybody else. He was really smart. And so the only way that you can do that is because you've got passion for the martial arts. If that was, Mrs. Anderson, tell me if you agree with this. If that was one of the reasons that people were attracted to him because of his passion, what are some of the other reasons, David? What do you think?
Mr. Anderson was a mystery. I remember running across some fellow that knew one of Mr. Anderson's friends from back in the day, TR. And the individual who didn't really know much about Mr. Anderson, but he was trying to show off with the lady that he was with at that time, and it's one of the first times I ever got so mad I just about wanted to drop somebody where they were standing. But the guy had made a comment about, well, this individual was more interested in the practice. Mr. Anderson was more interested in the politics, and boy, did I tell you.
Oh, he was interested in
I run
everything.
into him, because the fact of the matter being, yes, Mr. Anderson became the first vice president of the World Union of Karate Organizations, which was the international governing body to the IOC, the International Olympic Committee at the time. Yes, he was involved in the politics. However, one of his major reasons for getting involved in the WUCO at the time was they had some of the most senior practicing martial artists available in the world. So he went there to get more information. He just happened to follow the political atmosphere, and he did very well with his understanding of Miyamoto Musashi's Book of Five Rings, Sun Tzu's Art of War. He was a master of the philosophies of the warrior, not just the physical attributes.
Yeah.
And so he became a complete, all-encompassing, true martial artist. He was a philosopher. He was an artist. I mean, painting, et cetera, et cetera.
He had paintings.
He created 7 katas, which are our style forms, which are very profound. He was constantly looking at things and trying to create something that was different, that would get the ideas of the ancient traditions across. He created our Kwanmukan kata, our 5-directional moving, north, south, east, west, and return to the philosophical center. He really opened our minds to so many things that we found that there was so much more to karate than just kicking and punching, and this is how you beat somebody up.
Yeah.
He taught the karate jitsu, which is essentially combative, effective martial arts, but he also taught the karate do, which I think is very important. I get so tired of hearing people talk about, well, I want to be better today than I was yesterday. I want to be better tomorrow than I was today. That L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetic self-help book. I have no use for that kind of stuff, because self-help and that kind of improvement is very finite. But a search for perfection of character is something that you can engage in for the rest of your life, and it is not finite. And I think that that is a major integrating thing of karate that Mr. Anderson shared with those of us who were his senior students.
So, Mrs. Anderson, I think that your husband had a significant influence on so many people. And he had a way of expressing things about martial arts that were really intellectual. And I think that what we just heard from David Ames, is a direct result of that. So you heard David talk about all of these things that were exactly what he got from Mr. Anderson. What other kind of things, how do you think he would have helped other people in the martial arts? Young people, older people, because he took everybody in.
No, he did.
He really did. He took a lot of the younger inner city kids in. Anybody that, if they didn't have money, right, Mom?
Oh, yeah.
He would train them.
Yeah.
And he didn't care about class or race or where you came
He didn't
from.
care about race, no. I didn't either, though.
No. Yeah, by the way, if you don't mind me inserting, Mom and Dad were both activists. I mean, both of them.
Yeah, I had God is love, mankind is one on my card.
Yeah, Mom actually was a
I went to Florida and Mother said, take that off. I said, I will not take it off.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Both,
so
I mean,
she,
yeah.
So, Mrs. Anderson, tell me about the first time that you met Mr. Anderson. What was it? What were the circumstances? Tell me that. Give me that story.
oh my gosh.
We hear it all the time. Go ahead, Mom.
George came to our house, and anyway, it wasn't until after he left, really, though, that Bud said, George said he's going to marry you someday. I said, he is not.
Now, mind you, I think Mom was 15, Dad was 12.
He said he was going to marry me someday.
And what did you think about that as a 12-year-old?
I said, but I just said, he is not. And that was ridiculous. I mean, he was my brother's friend. My brother was 3 years younger.
Yeah, then what else happened? There was a couple years past, and then what happened? Dad was 12 when he knew he was going to marry Mom.
Wow.
I know. He made up his boy. I'll tell you what. When he made up his mind about something, that's what he made up his mind about. But I didn't make my mind up. I was going to marry him. My gosh.
So it sounds like he also made up his mind about what he was going to do in karate, and that was it, right?
Yep, that's it. That was like it. That was it with me. It was it with karate also.
Hey, Ron, do you mind if we backtrack a minute?
Of course,
Back into
yeah.
the part- So, you know, when Il-Ju Kim was Dad's instructor, and he was at Akron U, and he taught that class at Akron U, and Dad went, and then Dad, you know, started reading and learning and became very involved in working with the others, not intentionally, because he really loved, we did that intentionally, but he never meant to hurt Il-Ju. And so actually, I think, you know, everybody was thinking, why isn't Dad getting paid? Because he was really the one that was doing all the teaching all the time and stuff. But I don't think my dad actually ever thought that. But when Il-Ju walked away from that and just had Dad get out, Dad continued at Akron U. And I can tell you that my dad was really hurt that Il-Ju left. And he felt bad about that. And so him and Mom would drive around and look for Il-Ju. Do you remember that, Mom? Because he felt bad about the ending of that relationship. And Dad always wished him the very best.
Oh yeah, George loved Il-Ju.
Yeah, so he never intentionally, took Il-Ju's class. That was because Dad had, I think what it was, and I think I told you this before, I think that, you know, Dad just had that passion. And I think that he ended up getting a lot of followers, and they worked out and got the karate club going at that time. And were you there when the karate club was formed? No, you weren't there yet. Then
Jeannie Dalton was there.
Jeannie Dalton was there.
She was there from the beginning.
Yeah.
Pat Hickey, I believe, was there from the beginning.
Yeah.
Mike Bukawa, actually it was Mike Bukawa that introduced Pat and Jeff Ellis to Mr. Anderson.
Yeah.
And so that was the first group that came in with him. Then Pam Hickey started training. She was Pamela Hicks, and then she became Pam Hickey. And then I came in with a few of the others. And so I never realized I was in the formation and the formulation of the Kwanmukan, but
Yeah.
I was there back in the beginnings. I think it's important to know about Mr. Anderson's and Il-Ju Kim's relationship, too. What had happened was Il-Ju Kim wasn't teaching, Mr. Anderson was teaching. Il-Ju would go into the university once a month to collect his check. And so he was getting paid. The university got wind of it, as I understand, but they had a meeting of the Akron U Karate Club. Mr. Anderson was not allowed to attend the meeting. He was the instructor. The only person who was allowed to attend were the members of the karate club and the faculty advisor. And it was the karate club that voted Il-Ju Kim out and voted Mr. Anderson to be the instructor. And as Mr. Anderson told me, he got home that night, Il-Ju Kim got news of it, called Mr. Anderson and was just screaming and yelling at him about it until Mr. Anderson finally told him, look, I had nothing to do with it. I couldn't do anything about it. And Il-Ju essentially said, well, then I think we should just part ways. You go train where you train, I'll go train where I train. So Il-Ju didn't really throw Mr. Anderson out. Mr. Anderson was not dismissed in embarrassment or in shame, which is also why he was able to hold his head so high in the traditional karate. Because in traditional karate, a lot of it depends on how did you leave your instructor. Was it bad blood? Were you to be blamed? Il-Ju Kim essentially held him harmless and faultless. So we did go to his tournaments, a few of them, but I do remember Mr. Anderson specifically telling us, back when I was a first degree black belt, that goes back a few years, that if Il-Ju Kim says anything, we will respect him, but we will not obey him. And so that's where there was a real clear separation at that point in time, and that's when Mr. Anderson really directed himself whole hog into the Kwanmukan, for which we're actually grateful.
So that's what I was going to say, is that sometimes with certain types of separations in the martial arts, and we've all got we can all reach back into our memory banks about the things that we know broadly about martial arts, that sometimes these separations, there's a lot of good that comes from this. So I think that, David, what you're saying is that if that separation doesn't happen, perhaps the Kwanmukan doesn't form in the way that it does.
Well, the Kwanmukan wouldn't have been formed the way it did. We would have never gotten involved in the WUKO. I would have never been a member of the United States World Team, and I would have never been a Pan American gold medalist. So for myself, personally, his separation was fortuitous, as well as the fact his study took a completely different direction at that point. So we were no longer doing just the Korean karate. I remember when he developed the Kwanmukan Kwan and Chully Park, who was Mr. Anderson's mentor and was actually Il-ju Kim's first teacher in Korea. Il-ju Kim switched teachers when he came here to the United States and met Dong Chu Che, and that's when Che convinced him to transfer to the Kwan. So Mr. Anderson reconnected with Chully Park then when he got into the WUKO, because Chully Park happened to be the president of the South Korean national governing body to the WUKO. And when Mr. Anderson created our kata Kwanmukan Kwan, which has Chinese aspects, Okinawan, Japanese, and Korean, the difficulty of the form is knowing which is which and how to do them, which is a really interesting thing. But we are not an eclectic system. He traced us directly back to the Northern Chinese, which is the real influence that came into the Okinawan karate. Southern Chinese as well as Northern Chinese came into Okinawa. So we have the influence from there. Northern Chinese, or the Chuan Fa, which later became known as Kung Fu, came through the Korean peninsula directly from China. So you had that influence, which then in Korea was called Kwanpa or Kwanpa Pu, which is the same as Chuan Fa. So we have that. We have the Korean aspects. We also come from China to Okinawa to Japan, so we have those attributes. And I remember Mr. Anderson had me demonstrate Kwanmukan Kwan for Park Shihan. And Mr. Park had said, after I had done the form, that is the most brilliantly authored form I have ever seen. He said, keep in mind, in Korea, you only do Korean. In Japan, you do Japanese. In Okinawa, you do Okinawan, etc., etc. He said, this form, you are so fortunate because it has all four values.
Yeah.
And we would have never had anything like that had Mr. Anderson not separated with Il-ju Kim. We might have had our Kwanmu form and certain other things, but I think it was very fortuitous because he started seeing the failings of the Taekwondo. That's also why we went into the WUKO, because he looked at the rules of the first Taekwondo, and he didn't like the rule set. He didn't agree with it. So that's when he saw that the WUKO was much more fitting to our movement, and much more along the lines of the old traditional Korean karate. The Taekwondo movement at that time was just starting to develop into what Taekwondo has become, which is essentially become a sport, as opposed to having the martial values. Mr. Anderson wanted to maintain the martial values and understanding that we have sport karate, and that is not the martial values, so it is our sport aspects. But then Mr. Anderson really delved into what we would call Budo, or the martial way, and that is the core of our practice. And I really believe that this history, as you said many times, separations lead to good things. I think that that was something that it did. It led to something really, really positive for us.
So I'd like to tell you, Joni and David and Mrs. Anderson, I always thought, and I thought many things about Mr. Anderson, but I thought that one of the things that always crystallized with me is that anytime I had an opportunity to talk to him or train with him, I was always left with the feeling that he was one of the preeminent scholars on martial art, certainly in the United States, but maybe globally on a worldwide basis, because he just knew everything. So, Mrs. Anderson, my question to you is, you saw this early on, maybe as a 12-year-old, but where did this come from? Where did this come from in him, do you think?
I don't know, but he sure was smart.
You know, that brings to mind, Mom, tell them when Dad, tell Ron about when Dad came to you and told you he was going to do karate full time. My dad owned a roofing business.
I know.
And so he gave all of that up completely for karate. So tell him about that.
I kind of forget it. I might have wanted to. That would be scary, really. If you think about it, you got 5 kids here, little ones, and your husband's going to quit something.
He came to you and he told you, Joan, I'm thinking I'm gonna give up the roofing business and I'm gonna go into karate full time. And Mom, you told him, if you think you can do that, go ahead. She told him to go ahead because she said whatever he set his heart to.
And so what that sounds like to me is that you always supported Mr. Anderson and what he wanted to do.
I did. Because he was pretty smart, actually.
Very versatile. He knew how to do everything.
No, he did. He was 3 years younger than me, but he was smart.
So I want to talk about a little bit about what you just said. And you said, hey, look, from a practical side, in the podcast, I always ask practical questions, kind of like, how does martial arts influence your daily life? So in daily life, one day, Mr. Anderson came home, and again, as you just said, 5 little ones running around and said, I'm not doing that business anymore, that roofing business. I want to do martial arts full time. So you probably, what did you feel about that? What did you think?
I don't know, because then he did some of it in the house, because he didn't have a gym at first, and I thought, seriously, he didn't have a gym at that time. When he put Mr. Kim
At the house,
It was
Orlando Avenue.
Was it on?
We were in Orlando, and then we went over to Tower Hill,
Yeah.
and then they all came over there.
Yeah, first did they come to Orlando first? Mm-hmm. Yep. Wherever he went, they followed. And he was. I never saw anybody like him. He was dead serious. When he wanted to learn something, by God, he went through it. He learned it. He studied. He was smart. Mom didn't like him. She thought you've destroyed yourself and all that crap. And I said, yeah. I didn't worry about what Mom thought. She just didn't know any better.
Mom was very supportive of Dad. When he wanted to go from roofing and spatting to karate, yeah, she was very supportive. She said, if you think you can do it, let's do it.
Yeah. Well, you can get hurt both ways. You can fall off at roof, or you can get knocked out. So.
And Mom liked to complain, but one of her favorite things was hosting. We had Park. She had Park. He would come to the house and stay. Remember Park?
Oh yeah.
And what did he say about beautiful?
What?
Park. He'd say you're beautiful. Park
remember.
loved my mom. He cooked, she cooked and she took care of him. He stayed with Mom and Dad he'd come and stay, for quite a while.
And he said what?
Oh, he always thought you were beautiful.
Oh God.
So, on that note, I am going to conclude by saying, Mrs. Anderson, this was a knockout podcast. So, Mrs. Anderson, thank you. Shihan Ames, thank you. Sensei Joni, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to this very special episode of the Kwanmu Monolog. That's a wrap.
Hello, listeners. I wanted to provide additional commentary with respect to this edition of the Kwanmu Monolog. As we concluded its recording, it became evident that there was additional information that we wanted to make sure that the listeners had access to. Please listen to the continuation of this very special episode of the Kwanmu Monolog.
Oh, I remember when the guys would come over, the karate guys would all come over. We had, Bob Cheney, Bob Saul, Tony Clark, David, Carol Hofer would come. Mm. And by the way, just to mention, I get Carol every week, still comes. But we would, all those guys would come. So we had, on Orlando, we had a little back deck. It was pretty small at the time. And then you go down the stairwell, a little stairwell, and there would be like a cellar that you could go down in. But Dad would have all the guys over, and they'd put like 2 chairs up. So they would put their feet on one chair and their backs on the other, and they'd put these really huge bricks on the chest or whatever. And these guys would take, what was it, David? Sledgehammers. Another thing that they did, and
You know, some of that stuff is ridiculous.
Another thing these guys did, they would get those huge buckets that were like from Home Depot.
Yeah.
And they would fill them with salt, rock, and like beans, what they do. And they would just take their hands and they would continuously, the guys.
Hand conditioning, right?
Yeah, they did.
And then develop hands that look like a foot.
Right.
And another thing, and this is one thing that EJ and I did. In fact, I to this day I can tell I did this, you know. But Dad had numerous mockery boards up around the house or
yes.
whatever. So the guys would sit and they would punch. But we as kids did too. We'd drill on them a lot when we were little. But those are some of the fun times I remember that all the guys would come over
Made me
and
feel like
just
punching
do all these, so
someone.
the constant brick breaking, wood breaking, and then,
In the early days of the New Year's Eve parties.
oh yes.
Yeah.
And that was back when we were all after-you students. We didn't have kids in the dojo at the time, so the parties could get a little bit raucous. And he
I think I heard about those parties.
Excuse me.
I think I heard about those parties.
He had a makawara mounted on the wall in his living room. Matter of fact, it was it was like the jam in between the two.
Yes.
And it got hit so much it actually shifted that wall over about 6 inches. And I remember that in the New Year's Eve parties, we're all over there punching those things, and then he'd set up these big candles, and with a punch, you had to put the candle out. So we're always doing all kinds of interesting things, and you never knew where you were going to get thrown. I have been thrown wearing a 3-piece suit in a 5-star restaurant without having any idea it was going to happen. When I was down in Honduras with him, I got thrown across the table in the middle of the dining room. And all the Hondurans were looking at that and thought that was just the coolest thing they'd ever seen. If that happened in the United States, we'd have been thrown out. So, yeah, I mean, when he wanted to show something, it didn't matter how you were dressed, which essentially is what happens in self-defense anyway.
Or where you were, restaurant, parking lot, didn't matter,
You
right?
didn't care.
Yeah, or where you work.
Yeah. I just, you know, just the flashback of all the things like that these guys used to do in the yard when all these guys would come over and stuff. I really have fond memories of all of it. And I remember Carol Hofer laying there with her feet.
Yep.
Doing what?
With her feet on one chair and her back on another, and a big brick on her chest and the sledgehammer.
I know, I thought the whole thing was ridiculous.
It was a lot of fun, though. Dad was on a good venture. I really personally think that, you know, people are born into this world with different things they're supposed to do. You do what you do. Mom does what she does. David did what he did and does, you know, and I personally. And I think that Dad had, you know, it was just in him to do what he did. He had vision, and I think that is something that was very attractive, is the vision, you know. He was able, you know, he was a visionary because he was able to allow other people to join in and see that vision and, you know, come along with him. And, you know, he was never alone. He always had a team. So it's all about team, you know. Yeah.
I didn't really see the vision.
I think overall, though, that was what he was meant to do, and he did great. I
loved him.
have
He
great
was smart.
respect for him.
He was on there.
Oh, yeah.